part of what's coming to me is, the need for distinctions in this kind of conversation. And you keep referring to this Healing Justice podcast in which Kate Werning interviewed Amita and Adrienne Maree. And they also keep going back to these distinctions, right? So for example, there is the kind of pleasure that is a taking, right? The kind of pleasure that our society offers us, which is short-lived, right? Which has kind of a hedonistic kind of emptiness about it. And then I'm not judging any kind of practice. It's just kind of the energy or the spirit that we come into it with. And even Adrienne, and I bring this up because I've heard you talk about it in this way. She said something to the effect of, I learned that I could have an orgasm, right? But even then, it was kind of this thing that I could work my way to grab, and then, right? And that's not what she was aiming for in her pleasure quest. And we've had these conversations, right? We've had this explicit conversation in intimacy, right? Like that there's this kind of chasing for the thing, which is different from opening up to the thing. And you speak so well about it. And I think it helps us sift through what kind of pleasure is and what the other kind of pleasure is, and maybe helps to illuminate what you mean. I'm wondering if you have a thought about that.
Yeah. I think, I've started to use, I think Buddha talks about don't believe, and many teachers these days say, don't believe what I say. Just practice it for yourself. And if you find it to be true, then believe it. Don't take don't take it for true straight away. Use your own body, tune into your own body. And so I, think of this pleasure that's generative, creative, pleasure that brings more to your life, to your everyday life, brings more to your relationships. Just is as I would think, creative and generative pleasure. The more you do, the more it gives. The pleasure that keeps giving. And then I think there's other kinds of pleasure that are like peak and bust, or peak and crash pleasure, which is probably more intense at the peak. But after that, there's a crash. And the crash could be a physical crash. It could be an emotional crash. It could be a mental crash. And the same activity could have a peak and crash impact on one person and a generative, creative, expansive impact on someone else. And so I wouldn't say it's so much activity-based, but more yourself, trusting your own body. And, obviously the generative creative is what I'm aiming for, because it's also connecting. It's also, it goes with abundance. When you have pleasure that's generative and creative, it's inclusive. Right. It can include more things, more people. It can include more dimensions of your life. And the peak and crash type of pleasure is very narrow focus. It's only that thing that gives you the peak, only that thing. And so it narrows us into a particular direction, and it will exclude certain relationships or activities. So I speak at it very abstract, because I feel like when we get into details, people can start thinking about it, but get distracted. But I want us to really focus on those principles.
Yeah, but if you let me, I will offer maybe one less abstract example, just because I think it's helpful. In sexual practice, right? The culture, we are conditioned in Western culture to go for like the peak orgasm, right? And so certainly for men, the peak orgasm is followed by a drop in energy. And as we enter the tantric practices, we learn to kind of expand the vehicle, grow the vehicle, let that energy move, and like kind of release the attachment to that contraction at the end, and move energy more through the body. And I only bring that up not because I need to get into sexual practice here now. In fact, I'm intentionally not. I want to talk a little bit about that. But because I think it's a good example. It's a very
Yes.
obvious example, right?
Yes.
Like the explosive end versus the expansive
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
growing a vehicle, which actually at the beginning of that practice feels like you're losing something,
Mm.
right? But just a little bit of time with it, you understand how much more expansive
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and generative and
Mm-hmm.
life-giving the
Mm-hmm.
pleasure is, and I think especially so for men, where
Mm-hmm.
that crash is so real
Mm-hmm.
after the more
Yes.
like culturally sanctioned conditioned orgasm.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Um, I want to say one piece, just to put the thought out there of it's a side thought, but it's not a side thought. It's a very important thought. But I wanted to name it. Is the connection between the male orgasm and capitalism,
Mm.
which focuses on the accumulation of wealth.
Mhm.
And so there's this accumulation of a lot of money is really energy,
Mhm.
and so there's accumulation of energy, and then holding it and storing it, and then able to deploy it
Aha.
at one at will.
Yeah.
At
Wow.
a to buy a low stock, or to buy $1 million or $10 million house, or to
Yeah.
so this deploying, and it really gives a sense of satisfaction of power. I can buy this $1 million. I can buy these whatever, even buy this blender. There's a satisfaction.
Yes.
So our consuming and our satisfaction of that one shot purchase is very connected. I won't go so much into
No, but
it,
that
but
was
I wanted
insightful. Yes.
to just hint at how everything is so connected.
Mhm.
You know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I never
Yeah.
thought about it in those terms.